So hello everyone, I'm really happy that you came here, although it's Friday afternoon and it's such a beautiful weather in Prague. I hope in Graz too. Maybe let me just introduce briefly myself and shortly Sarai, and I'm sure she will tell you a little bit more about it. Actually, me and Sarai, we worked together for, I would say maybe 3 or 4 years. Actually, my first experience with Children Museum was when I was directing Sladovna in Písek, and because I needed to actually develop the expertise, I started or I joined the work of Hands-on Association, International Association of Children in Museums. And colleague, and Sarai was actually one of my dearest and closest colleague, and we two developed together in last 3 years something like 8 criteria, or let's say like a vision of how museums could act in 21st century as places of education. We developed such a set of their characteristics, of criteria of quality, and then a little bit later on a label of the quality. And I'm actually out of the association now, but Sarai continues, and Sarai now works on the position, or she does it externally because she also has a baby, as actually she evaluates the museums which want to claim themselves to be the places of education for 21st century. Sarai, I'm passing the word to you.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Hi, everyone, and thank you, everyone, also for switching to English just for me, because I don't know any Czech, even though I've known Teresa for quite some time yet. She even knows German, but yeah, probably now finally I should start learning Czech. Thank you, the festival organizing team, for inviting me to talk to you today. And maybe just a few words. Teresa already introduced me. I've been working for Hands-on International for 6 years now. And Hands-on International Association of Children in Museums is a network since 1994. It was founded by the first children's museums directors of Europe to exchange best practices, and it has grown ever since. And as Teresa already mentioned, in the past couple of years, we had together the opportunity through this EU project to really work and research some basic terminology, definitions, etc. And also, which was really, really important for us, but also for the network itself, put stuff into writing. Because the issue is, especially with children's museums, even though they've already started 124 years ago, loads of knowledge is tied to individuals, and with them leaving the field, we lose all this knowledge. And especially for people who are new to the field or just starting their children museums journey, find themselves without much specific references. And so we are really, really grateful that we had this opportunity to dig into this topic and really, after loads of workshops with members, discussions and research, put out something, put some things into writing so that everyone else has a starting point. I will start to share my presentation. Please just give me a short feedback if you can see it.
Not yet.
1 second.
I just will tell you a little bit about the structure of the speech now. Sarai will start and she will introduce you a little bit into the phenomena of Children's Museum, then a little bit about the history of the association and how the initially really specific knowledge or expertise of children's museums actually then came into use by actually classical museums and galleries, how this transition happened. And then together we will actually try to explain you how we envision the museums as places of education, and actually will also enable you to meet some of the colleagues in Europe, actually as good examples of the work. We still don't see the presentation, Sarai.
Sorry. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
It's always... So, sorry for this. Now, can you see it?
Yes, it is here.
Yes, finally. Sorry for these technical hiccups. Sometimes, I don't know. So basically, just to kick off all this, I think we just gonna dive a little bit into the history, because as I already mentioned, children's museums and children in museums, it's not a really new idea, but in fact it has a long-standing history, even though unfortunately very often the level of professionalism is not recognized, because probably you all work with children in culture. You've heard this before, that you do something just for children, as if this was the easier option. So let's start by looking back. So generally, the idea of children requiring other learning settings than adults developed in the 19th century, along with the perception of childhood as an independent stage of life, separate from adulthood, before children were actually perceived as little adults. And as you probably know, children's museums as independent organizations started out in the US. It started all out in Brooklyn with Brooklyn Children's Museum in 1899. And for the first time ever, a museum developed its own educational concepts specifically for children. And they believed that the presentation of classical museums was too complex and not appealing enough for children, but that museums actually had the potential to help children discover the world. So, for example, they introduced objects at eye level of children. Some display cabinets were even left open, and labels and text written in easier languages so children could understand. And also they conducted workshops. And a few years later, the Boston Children's Museum opened at the second of its kind. And then again, a couple of years later, in the 1960s, a next huge leap of development happened. This actually happened in Boston Children's Museum, and they first created the hands-on approach. And you can see it in the picture. This was the first ever hands-on exhibition called What's Inside, and it was created by Michael Spock in 1961. And he was inspired by this, the learning by doing theory of John Dewey. And this really marked a new era of children-oriented museum work, which caused children's museums to mature and gain independency from the standards, functions, and working methods of classical museums, and starting to develop a more independent identity as a very specific type of cultural organization. And as a result, because this exhibition was really, really popular, the concept gained popularity and support across the whole US. And today, there are over 250 children's museums in the United States alone, and we reckon about 400 worldwide. And the trend is rising, which is also a very interesting fact, I think, that children's museums are actually the strongest growing branch of the museum industry. But now let's take a look at Europe. In contrast to the US, European children's museums are rather young. So, and given a different tradition of cultural policy, of funding, additional concepts of children's museums were developed. And like many projects in Europe up to today, the first European Children's Museum, the Junior Museum of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, which opened in 1970, is an in-house children's museum. This of a traditional museum. And this is totally different from the Children's Museum concept in the US. And Junges Museum Frankfurt and also Tropenmuseum Junior of Tropenmuseum Amsterdam are probably the best known representatives of this type of children's museums. The first standalone children's museum, similar to US Children's Museum in terms of independency, was Le Musée Herbe in Paris, and it was an art children's museum and opened in the mid-70s. And along with them, in Europe, a lot of traveling or pop-up children's museums were developed. Some of them actually then being institutionalized with an actual house, and others staying up to this day traveling museums. And however, most European children's museums were only established from the 1990s onwards, along with the start of the general museum boom and the rising awareness for children's advocacy, actually in the connection with the ratification of the UN Charter of Children's Rights, which was also around that time. But so now you're probably going to ask yourselves, why did children's museums take almost 100 years to reach Europe? So we don't really know why, but I suppose like everything in Europe, this is highly diverse and multifaceted. And also additional to the inspirations and influences of the US children's museums, other developments impacted the establishment of the sector. But did European museums just ignore children for that long? No, actually not. In fact, they already started targeting families in the late 18th century. But they targeted the whole family, not explicitly children. So the concept was totally different. And out of this practice, specific children's programs were developed from the 1930s onwards. And evidently, these programs were always linked to the exhibition for adults. So historically speaking, European museums did detect the great potential of children as a target group and the necessity to provide programs specifically for them simultaneously to US institutions. Just they had another concept of feeding this need. And additionally, in Europe, child-led education has actually a long history, especially when it comes to the idea of self-reliant educational approaches. Comenius, you of course all know him, with his Didactica Magna, which can be seen as the first charter of childhood, influenced Rousseau's idea of individual education. And they both took into account the character of a child and emphasizing inquisitive learning. And these ideas were then also picked up by Froebel, Montessori, Steiner, Reggio Emilia, etc. So all the European progressive educational methods. Parallelly to this is also interesting because this actually is not really connected to this other development of the progressive education, but it's a parallel strand, is art education. Expressionist artists like members of the Blue Rider group, such as Kandinsky, Klee, and Mark, they also picked up on the idea of encouraging the natural curiosity of children. And actually, they even named children as one of the greatest source of inspiration. And these progressive ideas were carried on by the alternative movements in the 1960s, leading to a great variety of art educational projects dedicated to children. And loads of artists and art educators focused on programs like this, but interestingly enough, they never really connected with museums directly as institutions. So they were independent from them. But this already shows that children, or working with children, has a long history in Europe as well. However, in-depth, audience-oriented museum work definitely only took hold in Europe with the children's museums boom in the 1990s. And another thing I would like to mention here in the history, because very often children's museums are seen a bit of the outsider, as not as proper museums, especially also in connection with ICOM, because many of them don't meet one of the current ICOM standards, which is having a collection. So for ICOM standards, a children's museum without a collection, which most of them are, is not a museum. And so they're not so taken not so seriously. But interestingly enough, children's museums are actually historically closely interlinked with ICOM and the standardization and professionalism of the international museum industry, because actually when ICOM was founded in 1946, they had a separate children's museums committee. And I think that's very notable, especially for the time, with a female chair and mostly female members. And this female chair, she even held one of the opening speeches at the ICOM founding conference in Paris. And I think this is very remarkable because today, within the ICOM sector, children's museums are not really deemed relevant anymore. But when it actually comes to the founding times of ICOM, they were. So now I would like to move a little bit further, more into the present. Now from children's museums to children in museums, because evidently, the children's museum movement has led to a large scale of rethinking and boost of innovation throughout all museums and galleries. Because today, basically every museum and gallery has a children's program of some kind. I personally, at least, don't know any museum or gallery that hasn't any at all. So this development led to a change also in our organization in Hands-On, because before Hands-On was named Hands-On International Association of Children's Museums, and then it became renamed into Hands-On International Association of Children in Museums, just to reflect on this change and also open up to other organizations as well, who also do great children's programs. But today, children's museums or hence visitor-centered programming for an intergenerational audience with interactive hands-on exhibitions and playful approaches are to be found really in a multitude of cultural organizations and are really not limited anymore to classical children's museums. And to better reflect the various types and forms of the sector, we have chosen the term children-focused museum work. It's a bit long, but we came to the conclusion that this actually is a terminology that works best for what we try to express. So children-focused museums or children-focused museum work can be children's museums, science centers, galleries, and similar cultural organizations with particular emphasis on permanent, heritage-based, and interactive children's programming. So this is also one of these first definitions for you. It's a bit long, but for us and also for Hanson as an association, it was really important to come up with this and now say, okay, who do we actually consider as part of this group of this work? Who do we share this work with? Because, as I said before, it's not just children's museums and it's also not just museums today. However, it is still important to distinguish between organizations that offer children-focused museum work and children's programs in like many classical museums offer. Obviously, classical museums can also be children-focused museums, but not necessarily. So what's the difference here? The key difference here is that traditional institutions at a core always work collection-based, whereas children-focused museums create storytelling exhibitions based on the interests and needs of their target groups. Still, they may use original objects and collections to tell these stories, but as tools and never to display the objects just for their own sake. And importantly, education in children-focused museum is not a separate function, but really interlaced with all parts of the organizational body. So you know, we also do education. Education really is everywhere and is really an important focus and really woven into the organization's DNA, so to say. And thanks to this very distinct focus, they have the possibility to tackle whichever topic they believe to be particularly relevant for children and visitors of their region and community. And by this, they can quickly react and pick up on recent developments. So now you might be asking yourself, especially maybe if you're from a not yet children-focused organization, what are the benefits of implementing children-focused museum work for organizations? So interestingly, this enables them to reach many more groups, not just children and families, who usually tend to not visit museums. Because meeting the needs of children and families makes a place accessible for other groups too. For instance, just think, if you're stroller friendly, you're also mostly wheelchair friendly. If you use easy language, you also appeal to people, for instance, who are new to the parish and still learn the local language, or tourists, or also adult museum newbies who otherwise would be feeling stupid and not educated enough to go into a museum, or simply feel it's too little engagement or action for them. These are actually quotes from friends and families of mine. I asked them why they don't go to museums or what they see in museums. And I think this is really an important thing we must not forget. For visitors, visiting a museum is a free time activity. So a playful and interactive approach connects generations, because not everyone knows how to read or has the same level of education, but everyone knows how to play. So play is really highly inclusive towards all groups of society. And this also helps securing new visitors on a long-term perspective, apart from now tourists and classical museum goers, which not exclusively, but quite often are also the older generation. And there's always the risk, as you know, of the audience dying out over time if not new and younger people come in as well. During the workshop setting, we will then also focus a little bit more on practical inputs on the working mode, how actually children-focused museum work can look in practice. For now, I would like to focus a little bit, just quickly, on the role of children-focused museums in society. So what is their uniqueness, their potential, also their impact, or even what are their superpowers? And when looking at the past and present developments of the sector, we just uncovered the key question is, what do these present and past developments of the sector mean actually for the future? So to make this a bit more clear, I would like to take a look at the generation model, which was actually inspired and loosely based on the ideas of Gail Lord. And we developed it further as part of this project over the past few years, just to really get a clear picture of the overall development of the self-conception and the impact and on the sector's role and in and for society. So we start with the first generation. And the first generation children's museum are actually not the museums, but when the sector was in this first generation, this happened with the establishment of children's museum. And this lasted roughly until the 1980s. And here the creator was hands-on, making exhibitions interactive and using play as the main tool for this. And this was tailored to the needs of the then industrial economy. So the industrial economy required children and adults to be actually compliant learners and follow set directions. And this is what the children's museums then offered their audiences. They offered a playful environment, but we're focusing on teaching children how to adopt expected behavior and views. But soon society did change again, and entering around 1970, by featuring a broader range of topics and following an approach of offering multiple perspectives, the second generation children's museums started to implement and focus on critical thinking and rather asking critical questions, and demanding the reflection of one's own behavior. And the need for critical thinking corresponds with society transforming from the industrial economy, which we had before, to a post-industrial knowledge economy, where basically everything evolves around the power of assessing, processing, and processing information. And in this course, also, as I mentioned before, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was ratified, came up and then was ratified. And at this point, the sector started to really also focusing on becoming true advocates for children. And now we believe we've reached another transforming point, entering the third generation. And Here I would like to share a quote of Dr. Cynthia Scott for UNESCO. She's a researcher on childhood. And she says that globalization, new technologies, migration, international competition, wars, changing markets, and transnational environmental and political challenges all drive the set of skills and knowledge needed by students to survive and succeed in the 21st century. Yet, at the moment, there's no single prescribed approach to educating young people for the 21st century. And also, when you think about the state-of-the-art educational methodologies we use, like Montessori, etc., they are all 20th century. So now the big question is, what can the role of the children's museums and children-focused museums be now? How can they support but also survive in society and stay relevant for the audience? And the new focus in our point of view is now especially on quickly adapting to the needs of the audience and being a really trusted source of information and therefore education, because museums actually rank amongst the highest trusted organizations in trust service, scoring much higher than governments or even schools. So we think now it's really about focusing on fostering soft power by taking on the role of change agents, sensing what the society will need in the future. And this also marks the turning point from children's museums to children-focused museums, as more types of museum organizations started to embrace a children-focused approach and also started to cater to these specific needs and focusing on soft power and empathy. And as Teresa already mentioned before, as part of this, we have created this vision, this like a manifesto of 8 characteristics, and also in a where organizations can commit to, and in the second step also a really assessment scheme with certain working standards and quality criteria to really set a baseline for children-focused museum work, and turning them basically into homes of 21st century education. And now, as you can already see, I would like to hand over to Teresa to introduce you a little bit further into this manifesto and the 8 characteristics.
Okay, so, but please stay connected because you'll help me out with the good practices, yeah?
Sure.
Okay, so maybe I try to repeat something or say something in a little bit different words, maybe just for myself, also to review it. We simply, because, you know, like in the association, we were meeting a lot of museum experts from all over the world, and we somehow intuitively knew that we somehow see the quality of our work similarly or in similar terms. But the question was like how to put it in words. What is actually how we believe that really a good museum, good gallery, good interpretation center, how it really can be, that it is today relevant, that it's relevant to today's children, to their parents, to their teachers, caregivers, to simply the broad society. So we developed actually this 8 characteristics we'll walk now through. So the first one is that institutions like this should act actually always, okay, I used it, this I actually used like that it is in Czech. I can use it because Sladovna Písek actually developed or translated it. And I will first say it in English and then will a little bit more explain in Czech, that you have maybe a little bit better insight and maybe you're a little bit better able to connect it with your work. So these places should always actually act like door to culture. It means that they should be easily accessible public places of joy, beauty, and imagination. Each of these places plays a role of a locally, easily accessible and comprehensive place for all, public refuge of well-being and enjoyment, heritage, aesthetics, and imagination. And the crucial thing is that these places serve as entrance institutions in cultural life. Yeah? Tyhle ty organizace vždycky vlastně je podstatné, aby sloužily jako vstupní brána do světa kultury. To znamená, že jednak mají všechny vlastně ty aspekty jako muzeí a galerií. To znamená, že nesou sebou, prostě pracují s kulturním dědictvím, ať hmotným nebo nehmotným, představují něco, na co se dá spolehnout, mají prostě něco, k čemu se můžeme vztáhnout a zároveň třeba nesou sebou krásu, to je také důležité. Ale zároveň je důležité to, aby tady v těch místech vlastně, aby ta místa byla přístupná, aby byla přístupná i dětem a i lidem, kteří mají různé prostě bariéry. Takže ta místa musí být dobře dostupná a musí být srozumitelná. Ty vlastně důležité aspekty jejich jak jako well-being, takže důraz na to, jak se ty lidé tam cítí, jestli jim tam dobře, to znamená i o tom, jaké je tam světlo, jestli se můžou najíst, vyčůrat, přebalit dítě, vlastně všechny tady ty praktické a atmosférické věci. Je důležité, aby ti lidé, kteří tady přicházejí, aby zažívali něco jako radost, ale aby se opravdu setkávali s kulturním dědictvím, s krásou a s představivostí. A důležité taky je to, aby tyhle ty místa měly vlastně nějaké ukotvení tady a teď. To znamená v tom místě, v tom konkrétním městě, aby vlastně fungovaly pro určitou konkrétní komunitu. Sorry, can I ask you for the second one? Okay, no, sorry. For the good examples. Sorry, your turn.
However you want it, we can also do it the other way around. And I just wanted to share a little bit with you how this could be implemented in practical. It can also be done differently, but I would like to share with you a little bit the story of Junges Museum Frankfurt, because they are a children's museum, an in-house children's museum, actually located in the very museum district. They have their own rooms, their own exhibitions, but they also have family trails, actually in the same color coding of the museum, all over the classical museum, the historic museum Frankfurt, they are housed in. So they are also inviting children to explore the whole building, because and showing them it's also something for them. And in the past, they've now been with the big museum since I think 2019, but in the past they also had a very, very low threshold location. They were located in actually in a busy metro station in Frankfurt, and so many people literally just stumbled into the Children's Museum without actually knowing what it was by accident. And this is a great example of being an entrance institution, because it really invited people in, or was open to people who probably would have never set foot into a museum in another context, if it was like really going to this historic city center, getting there, getting a ticket, etc. And they also established that their having the birthday party there is already like a Frankfurt tradition. So basically every child that grows up in Frankfurt celebrates its birthday in the Children's Museum at least once, because it's just a thing to do. So I think this is a great example to show you a little bit how this can work.
I would maybe like to add that it's when you come there, it looks very, very 19th century. Very, very much. But I love being there, and I also love seeing children like playing there, because it really connects beautifully the really very, very classical museum with really very low threshold way to actually deal with children and with how they actually enable them to play, to come into the spaces. So it's really one of my favorite museums, and if you are in Frankfurt by chance, I highly recommend. Sarah, do you have more practices, or shall we go to the second one? To learn by play.
I only have one per.
Okay, good.
Characteristic.
So, learning by play, that's a very important aspect. Home of interactive self-learning, trying out the unknown, astonishment and imagination. It's educational lab, incubator of contemporary education, continuously creating and improving hands-on, mind-on, heart-on learning experiences. It researches, develops, and tests innovative educational practices. It offers play-based, interdisciplinary, multi-perspective, and interactive experiences where imagination, creativity, and curiosity for the unknown are at home. So, česky. Vlastně ten základní bod je, že děti se učí sami tady. To znamená, že se vybírají to, co chtěli dělat, podle toho, v jakém jsou vývojovém stádiu, v jakou mají náladu, co zrovna potřebují. A učí se prostě hrou nebo interakcí. A od toho se vlastně odvíjí ten základní koncept té vlastně muzejní práce s nimi. Že vlastně ti, kdo to muzeum řídí nebo provozují, tak vlastně vytváří prostředí a impulzy ke hře. Ale tu samotnou hru si řídí to dítě. A potom ti, co to muzeum provozují, tak v podstatě pozorují to dítě a vlastně interagují, nebo nejenom dítě, i dospělé. Pozorují to dítě a navazují na něj. Podle toho třeba upravují ty exponáty, vyvíjejí je dál. Vlastně to je taková jako nikdy nekončící hra s tím návštěvníkem nebo s dítětem, kdy vlastně neustále reagujete na to, co to dítě potřebuje, co ho baví, jak se ta hra vyvíjí, a pak se to třeba i přelívá do vlastně dalších prostě procesů, do dalších expozic. Z toho vlastně taky vyplývá to, že tady v těch typech muzeí vlastně není možné, aby edukátor přicházel k hotovým expozicím. V podstatě ten edukátor nebo člověk, který zodpovídá za vzdělávání, musí být už v jádru toho tvůrčího procesu. To je vlastně jeden z velmi důležitých kritérií, protože v podstatě ta forma nemůže vzniknout bez myšlenek na to dítě. A právě proto, že vlastně ten personál a ten tvůrčí tým a vzdělávací tým vlastně neustále pozoruje to dítě, navazuje na něj a upravuje, vlastně připravuje ty nabídky podle něj, tak vlastně proto i říkáme, že tyhle ty organizace jsou vlastně živé jako laboratoře vzdělávání. A vlastně odsud se někdy potom i mohou třeba určité jako koncepty nebo prostě způsoby vlastně přenášet třeba do dalšího formálního vzdělávání. Sarah, can you introduce us to someone who's doing it well?
So it was a bit obvious, but it was just the first example that popped into my head, and it's Zlotowno Pisak. You hopefully all know. but it's especially this educational lab thing, testing new ways, new formats, methods, tools, because literally every time I talk to Adam or to Tomasz or anyone from the team, they tell me, yeah, we're actually now trying something new, and it's always something totally different, being it theater, being it puppets, being it dance, or something totally different. And I think this really sums up well also the potential, not just for themselves, these organizations have, like what you can try out, especially in this working with projects, because just because you're now trying out a new method or a new tool doesn't mean you have to do it all the time and it has to work perfectly for you. But I think it's a great perk that the sector works with exhibitions or workshops, etc. So I think we can really be bold and daring and just try things out. But on the other hand, also this is also great for the whole educational sector, because schools can also learn from this, because for teachers it's obviously much harder with the strict curriculums, with the more limited resources, to try out untested methods and tools. But if museums already tried out and provide feedback and knowledge and best practices, I think this can be also something then that can be integrated actually in formal education.
Okay, so let's go to the third one, which in English is called For All Senses, takže do češtiny to překládáme jako pro všechny smysly. A v podstatě jde o to, že ta nabídka, kterou připravujete pro návštěvníky, tak je vlastně dostupná pokud možno opravdu všemi smysly, vlastně na všech úrovních. Jak fyzicky, tak emočně angažující, tak vlastně zaměstnává vaši mysl. To, co je taky důležité pro vytváření nebo pro uvažování o tom, jak vlastně vytváříte produkty nebo prostředí pro to muzeum, pro galerii, tak je to, že vždycky uvažujete nad zážitkem, nad tím, jaký zážitek budou mít návštěvníci a snažíte se vlastně pro něj opravdu vytvořit impulzy. I'm done, sorry. This was easy.
Thank you. I usually notice that you're done, even if you're talking Czech. So my example here is in Singapore, the Keppel Center of Art Education, which is actually part of the National Gallery Singapore, but they have two separate spaces. And they really have a very holistic approach, because they offer immersive art spaces, very haptic. They use sounds, they use smells, they really use all senses. And basically, together with the artists, they create artworks that children can enter to experience and see the world of each artist. And these also change over time. And additionally, they also have workshops to try out the creative techniques this very artist also uses when creating other art.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's move to lepší svět, better world. Tady ten bod je vlastně hodně spojený s nějakou, já bych řekla, jako řídící ideologií, i když to zní trošku blbě. Řídící ideologií toho takovýchhle vlastně muzeí nebo galerií. V podstatě je to o tom, jak chápeme děti. My vlastně chápeme děti jako rovnocennou součást společnosti. Pro mě třeba to je taková teď jako aktuální věc, že děti jako do restaurací nepatří, mně přijde absurdní. Jo? Prostě si myslíme, že děti do veřejného prostoru patří a že je velmi důležité to, aby se vlastně učili, aby existovaly i veřejné prostory, které nabízejí dětem to přirozené učení toho, jaké jsou vlastně zdravé vztahy mezi dítětem, rodinou, komunitou a společností. Takže takováhle muzea v některých případech, i v těch jako úplně vlastně idealistických případech, třeba nabízejí i to, aby ty děti vlastně se podílely na vytváření odpovědí na to, co se děje ve společnosti. Některá tahleta muzea pracují opravdu i s velmi aktuálními problémy a třeba i se závažnými problémy a vlastně ale berou děti jako partnery, kterých se ty věci týkají. Třeba u environmentálních témat je to prostě bezesporu se to všech dětí týkat bude. Takže oni mají právo vlastně jednak o tom vědět, ale i třeba hledat nějaké řešení, protože to je pro ně i emocionálně potom mnohem jednodušší. Takže vlastně ty nejlepší příklady takovýchhle muzeí tady v tom směru opravdu nabízejí dětem příležitost vlastně řešit i velká témata a přicházet k řešeními, které se případně i můžou použít v reálném světě. A dětem vlastně se tím pádem přiznává jako velká míra autonomie. V podstatě jde o to, že jim musíte hodně věřit, že jsou jak kompetentní, takže mají třeba nápady, které jsou schopné jako posouvat vlastně tu společnost dopředu. Ono v širším měřítku nejde jenom o děti, ale vlastně jde i o osoby s postižením, o cizince, o všechny osoby, které jsou nějakým způsobem ohrožené vyloučením. Takže v podstatě jde o to vytvářet prostory, které jsou opravdu mimořádně inkluzivní a každému jsou vlastně schopné přiznat hlas a nabídnout mu něco, aby se mohl podílet vlastně na zapojení do společnosti.
So my example for this is Play Africa, which is located in South Africa, right inside the old fort on Constitution Hill, and which actually is the very foremost notorious prison complex where Nelson Mandela and also Mahatma Gandhi were both imprisoned. And the children's museums therefore transforms a place of fear and oppression into a place of joyful discovery and play, but also topic-wise, they really focus on teaching children about human rights, about democratic values of the Constitution, also their very own rights, and also as democratic values as cornerstones of society. They all have a voice. And in very playful ways, children are introduced to the concepts of equality, freedom, and human dignity, as well as South African history and democratic processes.
So the next point, the next aspect of the quality, in English we call it bridging the gaps, which I think it's actually fitting better than stírání hranic. A v zásadě jde tady o to, že ten prostor vlastně netvoříte nikdy jenom pro děti. Ten prostor vždycky tvoříte pro všechny generace. A to, proč je třeba praktické pracovat s dětmi, tak je to, že jsou nejkřehčí a jsou nejvíc ohrožené tím, že nebudou rozumět, že nebudou se schopni se zapojit. Jo? Proto je vlastně vždycky praktické začít od dětí. Ale v podstatě v těch místech jde ideálně o to bytí společně mezi generacemi. Jo? Vlastně takováhle místa by neměly fungovat jako odkladiště dětí, ale naopak jako vlastně místa pro celou rodinu a sdílení mezi generacemi.
So for this, I have a rather unusual example, which is actually Den Gammelby. It's an open air museum, but not really classical. It has a twist because people and visitors of all ages join the historic role play. And for instance, children are encouraged to act as sellers of fruits, like children would have done 100 or 150 years ago in historical costumes, and actually sell products to other visitors. So also engaging with all generations in their roles, and also seeing the differences, how playfully learning how would have an adult reacted 150 years ago, how do I speak to them today, etc. And they are assisted by historically trained staff. And it enables adults and children alike to playfully really dive into the lives of people 100 years ago, but also into the country's history. And they have a very nice debrief exercise as well. So always afterwards, when the role-playing finishes, they always have like a debriefing discussion group with all the people of all generations who took part in this, and they try to discuss differences, but also references to current day-to-day issues. What did they like? What was better? What is worse? What is similar? Etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the sixth in English is called Be Heard, to znamená být slyšen. Navazuje trošičku na ten pátý bod, ale vlastně v trošku konkrétnější rovině. V podstatě jde o to, že na obsahové rovině vytváříte prostor pro to, aby vlastně každý byl slyšet. Třeba dobrý příklad je teď výstava Evy Koťátkové v Národní galerii, kde vlastně Eva Koťátková vyzývá ke sdílení osobních příběhů, vlastně k různému projevení toho, jak se lidi jako cítí. Jde o uznání toho, že vlastně ta interaktivita nebo participace těch návštěvníků je opravdu jako v srdci každého návštěvnického zážitku, že prostě a děláte cokoliv, tak musíte umožnit tomu publiku, aby se projevilo. Ale je to také o tom, že pokud ty organizace takové mají být vůči svému publiku, tak takové musí být i vevnitř. Což znamená, že je vlastně důležitá určitá míra demokracie jak v těch samotných týmech a v jejich řízení, ale že je vlastně důležité, aby ty týmy byly i sociálně a kulturně diverzifikované, aby nebyly prostě jenom jednostranné. A to by mělo být vlastně reflektováno ve všech 5 úrovních fungování organizace, což už samozřejmě není úplně jednoduché. Jak co se týče personálu, tak v programu, v produktech, v propagaci, v partnerech, v tom, s kým spolupracujete, ale i v tom, jak jsou prostě nastaveny procesy a jak jsou třeba nastaveny ceny, ceníky, jak umožňujete publiku a třeba i právě tomu z těch znevýhodněných skupin, jak mu vlastně umožňujete se podílet na tom, co děláte.
An organization that really lives up to this diversity in every aspect of the work is Tropenmuseum Junior for me. They always conduct a 3-year research for each exhibition involving people from that very country, because they are a world culture museum, so they always choose a country in connection with the collection they have. And they really consult them at every step of the way. So then when the exhibition is ready, people who are originally from the country serve as guides through the exhibition. So the culture is really real, and they speak for themselves. It's not that anybody else or the curators or other educators who are not from the culture themselves talk about them. And this really shows children, I think, also the diversity in one culture, how each individual who maybe even share a culture but still live their individual ways and lives in this, and provides a very realistic but also diverse picture of how the world actually is. And I think this talking, letting them tell their stories and conveying the culture to children rather than talking about them is really an important step towards diversity.
And if you are in Holland and if you are in Amsterdam, I really warmly recommend. This was actually visiting Tropen Museum Junior was one of breaking points in my career in really thinking about how we can work with audience in museums. Until today, I'm thankful for them for actually showing me how far we can go. So I really warmly recommend. So, number 7, digitally aware and active. Ta základní myšlenka je taková, že děti vychováváme do světa, který už není jenom reálný, ale který je paralelně vedle toho i virtuální. Nebo ty světy už prostě existují vedle sebe, skrz sebe a je důležité, aby i vlastně ty organizace klasického střihu, aby vlastně dětem pomáhali se mezi nimi zorientovat, umět mezi nimi přestupovat, umět se vlastně s nimi nějakým způsobem vypořádat. Je to prostě úkol, který se pro vzdělávání a pro kulturu nějakým způsobem vyvrbil a vlastně myslím si, že teď už je vlastně se nedá obejít. Neříkám, že každé muzeum musí pracovat s digitálními technologiemi, že každé muzeum musí nutně pracovat s umělou inteligencí, ale myslím si, že už opravdu každé muzeum musí vlastně najít nějaký svůj přístup k tomu a vlastně vědomě volit, jak s tímhletím tématem zachází. A ještě jsem zapomněla říct, důležitý úkol vlastně tady s tím spojený je, že samozřejmě, co se týče třeba virtuality, tak potom je to vlastně docela jednoduché s dětmi, ale může to být trošku složitější s lidmi jako ze starší generace. Takže tam ten úkol je potom i hledání nějakých mostů, třeba jak komunikovat i třeba se starší generací, jak jim vlastně umožnit to, aby i mezi těmi virtuálními a reálními světy pořád probíhal ten mezigenerační dialog.
My practical example here is M9 in Italy. I actually could visit it in last autumn, and it's very interesting because it's actually an interactive multimedia space, and I have to admit I personally was a bit critical at the beginning because it's basically full of screens. And the idea is that the children use digital media as a tool to engage with the contents there. But the interesting thing there is that they present all digital exhibits, which are all based on Montessori principles. And they really go into also coding, maths, and digital tools, and take them and combine them with art. So they actually show children all these tools, but really to understand them so that they can become competent users and not just consumers, and then encourage them to create art with them, so express their own ideas. And I think this is a beautiful take on digital media because children really are empowered to become creators and use it as a tool to share their own thoughts and feelings and ideas.
And where is it, sorry? I don't know it.
In Italy, in Mestre.
Okay. You'll tell me later. Okay, so the last challenge we'd like to introduce you to is the constant change. V podstatě každé muzeum, ať vzniklo v roce 1715 anebo 2016, tak se pořád musí vypořádávat s tím, že ta doba se mění a mění se velmi rychle. Takže ten vlastně poslední náš požadavek vůči muzeum je ten, aby se snažili vlastně neustále jít s tou změnou a aby nestráceli vlastně tu ambici reflektovat na lokální úrovni i globální témata. V podstatě, aby spojovali vždycky jak to, co je v tom jako velkém měřítku, to, co je s tím, to, co je vlastně se děje v těch lokálních komunitách. A na organizační úrovni to samozřejmě souvisí i s tím, že i ty organizace vevnitř se musí transformovat a měnit. A to víme všichni, není vždycky úplně jednoduché.
So for this, I choose the practical example of Frida and Fred in Austria, in Graz. And because they now celebrate their 20th birthday, so they have actually gone through many transformations at this point of time. And they really are a great example of how they changed their exhibition styles to better meet their target groups, also their target groups, because they noticed that the target groups they choose for the first 5 years of their existence just didn't work well for the visitors. So they totally changed their concept of the exhibitions, how they divide it in terms of age, but also in terms of themes. They tried to cater to the immediate needs. For instance, there was a lack of children's theaters for children below 6 in the city. So they created a children's theater for toddlers and preschoolers. Then a few years later, there was a lack of museums for teenagers in the city. So they created, not in the Children's Museum, but as a separate house, a science activity center aimed at teenagers. And now, at the moment, they are creating the very first museum for people with dementia, not exclusively. So the idea is that healthy visitors of all ages can also participate, but that people who live in the facility, where also the museum is housed, can also experience safely and interactively the exhibitions there.
Okay, thank you, Sarai. I'll do now the bridging work to the other part. We now introduced you how we think that the museum institution, gallery institution,